I am absolutely going to testify. I won't even say his name. He is an evil being and is going to pay.
I think that I was just, living in this shame, living in all this sort of stuff of my past, and I wasn't able to move on. It was hard for me being that young and being in the industry and not knowing where to turn, and everyone, telling me they love me and, just turn their back on you in a second.
Diddy completely lost control in court. His voice raised, his hand slammed the table. Security moved in. The judge threatened to remove him. And all of it was triggered by Justin Bieber. Yes, Justin Bieber, the global pop star Diddy once mentored like a little brother. In the middle of the most high-profile lawsuit of Diddy's life, Bieber suddenly broke his silence, and everything changed. He didn't post a vague message. He didn't offer thoughts and prayers. He called out what he saw, and he made it clear. He believed Cassie Ventura. Within minutes, that single post was everywhere. Screens lit up inside the courthouse, prosecutors reacted, reporters ran out. Even Diddy's own lawyers couldn't calm him down. He knew it was over. What did Bieber say? Why did he turn against Diddy after all these years? And what exactly happened in that courtroom that left the world speechless? This isn't gossip. This isn't hearsay. This is the moment Diddy's empire cracked, live in front of the jury with his protégé holding the match. Let's break it all down. There was a time when Diddy's name opened doors and closed deals. He was more than just a producer. He was a gatekeeper, and one of the earliest signs of that power was his relationship with a teenage Justin Bieber. Industry insiders remember the way Diddy publicly aligned himself with the rising star, calling him his little brother, and even joking that he had custody over him for entire weekends. On the surface, it seemed like mentorship, but behind the scenes, there were murmurs. People in the business raised eyebrows when Bieber, barely 15, was being paraded at adult-only events, rubbing shoulders with power players at parties that didn't seem made for kids. For years, these stories floated around the edges of the internet, dismissed as gossip, brushed off as nothing. But now, with Diddy sitting in a courtroom and the walls closing in, those old headlines are taking on a much darker tone. What once looked like industry mentorship now feels like a breadcrumb trail leading to something deeply unsettling. And the person who has just torn open that trail with brutal honesty is Justin Bieber himself. The man Diddy once protected is now the same man threatening to expose him. Not through accusations, not through hearsay, but through lived experience and a long memory. Courtrooms are usually sterile places. Neutral, cold, procedural. But on the second day of the trial, something was off. Everyone could feel it. The air was heavier, the tension thicker, like something had been silently building overnight. Diddy entered the courtroom surrounded by his high-powered legal team, dressed in his usual designer armor, exuding a forced calm. He nodded to the press gallery and briefly scanned the room, but those watching closely noticed the subtle difference. His eyes darted faster, his movements were sharper, and his phone never left his hand. This wasn't confidence. It was surveillance. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something to him multiple times before the judge arrived, but Diddy barely responded. The prosecution side, meanwhile, was a flurry of subtle activity. Notes passed under folders, prosecutors whispering behind cupped hands, one of them frequently refreshing her tablet. It was clear they were waiting on something, and whatever it was, it had them alert and ready. Then Cassie walked in. No grand entrance, no dramatic flair. Just a quiet walk to her seat, flanked by close friends who formed a human wall around her. The contrast was unmistakable. Diddy had hired protection. Cassie had earned loyalty. She wore a plain black dress with a white collar. Simple, but sharp. The kind of outfit that doesn't shout, but commands attention. She didn't glance at Diddy. She didn't need to. Her posture said it all. Meanwhile, Diddy's facade began to crack. He kept pulling out his phone under the table, scrolling with quick, frantic swipes. At one point, his lawyer reached over and removed it, only to have Diddy take it back minutes later. Observers noticed his leg bouncing under the table. A vein in his forehead started to rise. The courtroom hadn't even been called to order yet, and he was already unraveling. No one knew it at the time, but Diddy had just seen a post online, one that would detonate everything he was trying so hard to contain. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't a leaked document. It wasn't even something from the court itself. The moment that shattered Diddy's composure came from his phone, an Instagram post. Simple, direct, devastating. Justin Bieber had finally spoken. In a public statement shared with his 270 million followers, he broke the silence that had hovered over his relationship with Diddy for years. And he didn't hold back. Bieber wrote that he had seen things firsthand. He talked about Cassie, about watching Diddy interrupt her mid-sentence during interviews, about seeing him grab her arm too hard at an after-party. He said he didn't fully understand what he was seeing back then, but now, in light of the testimony, it all made sense. The industry control, the emotional manipulation, the way Cassie was always on edge when Diddy was near, but it wasn't just the words that cut deep, it was the photo attached. An old snapshot of Bieber and Cassie at a music event smiling, harmless on the surface, but Bieber's caption hit like a bullet. "I should have said something sooner. I see it now." That one sentence flipped everything. This wasn't just support, this was confirmation. A first-hand witness, one who had once been under Diddy's wing, was now standing with the alleged victim publicly and unequivocally. Within minutes, the post was being passed from phone to phone in the courtroom hallways. Legal assistants were printing out screenshots. Prosecutors leaned in to strategize. Reporters started live tweeting. Diddy's legal team noticed the shift and panicked, trying to shield his view, but it was already too late. He had seen it, and he wasn't just blindsided, he was betrayed. A betrayal so deep, it didn't just rattle his emotions, it shattered his control. The moment the courtroom doors reopened, the energy was different. Gone was the stiff, procedural atmosphere. In its place was a low, nervous buzz. Something had shifted, and everyone felt it. Prosecutors were suddenly more alert. Reporters stopped typing and just watched. Even the jury, who technically hadn't seen the post, looked unsettled, sensing the shift from body language alone. Diddy sat rigid at the defense table, his fingers drumming against his leg. His phone now gone, but his mind clearly spiraling. His eyes stayed fixed on the table, not out of focus, but calculating. It was as if he was bracing for something big, and everyone around him knew it too. The first real signal came from the back row. One of the reporters gasped quietly and pointed to their screen. Then another whispered, "Did you see what Bieber posted?" That whisper turned into a chain reaction. Court officers had to step in and tell everyone to put their phones away, but the damage had already spread like wildfire. Legal assistants were now shuffling papers faster than usual, whispering in ears, passing sticky notes down rows of attorneys. The judge hadn't even entered yet, but the courtroom was bubbling beneath the surface. And then there was Diddy, still trying to keep his cool. But cracks were forming. He adjusted his tie repeatedly, rubbed his face like he was trying to wipe away the moment. He leaned over to one of his lawyers, whispered something, and then immediately shook his head as if disagreeing with their response. He was unraveling in real time. The jury may not have known what triggered it, but they could all see the change in demeanor, the loss of swagger, the sudden panic. Meanwhile, Cassie sat still, focused, her legal team unmoved. She hadn't even glanced in Diddy's direction, and that lack of reaction only made the silence louder. Diddy wasn't reacting to her. He was reacting to something far more personal. A man he once considered his creation had just declared himself an enemy. And that's when the fuse finally met the fire. It happened in seconds, but those seconds felt like they lasted an hour. Diddy didn't ease into it. There was no slow rise in volume, no warning. One moment he was seated, eyes locked on the courtroom table, and the next he was on his feet, breathing heavily, his entire body rigid with tension. The sudden movement made the bailiff flinch. Everyone in the room turned. The judge had barely opened her mouth when Diddy's voice cut through the silence. "After everything I did for that kid, loyalty means nothing anymore." His face was red, veins showing at his temples, hands clenched at his sides. The courtroom froze. Gasps came from the gallery as his outburst echoed off the walls. One of the jurors visibly recoiled, while another glanced at the judge in disbelief. Before anyone could fully process what he had said, Diddy slammed his hand down on the table so hard that a glass tipped and shattered across the courtroom floor. His lawyer rushed to his side, trying to whisper something in his ear, calm him down, anchor him. But Diddy shoved his hand away in full view of the court. He wasn't just losing composure, he was erasing the last of it. He wasn't done. His voice rose again. "This is all lies. She knows it. They know it." He pointed toward Cassie and then toward the prosecution's table. His eyes locked with the judge. And for a moment, it looked like he might storm toward the bench. The judge reacted instantly. She banged her gavel, not once, but 3 times. "Mr. Comas, sit down immediately or I will have you removed from this courtroom." Her voice sliced through the madness like a razor, but Diddy barely blinked. He was still in it, still fueled by betrayal, panic, rage. The bailiffs moved in. 2 officers approached, one from each side. Neither pulled a weapon, but both rested their hands on their belts, ready for anything. Diddy's lawyers were now fully surrounding him, speaking rapidly, one placing a hand on his shoulder to push him back into his seat. Eventually, and almost reluctantly, he sat, but not before muttering one final threat. "I'll make sure. He never works in this town again. Neither of them will." That line, audible to everyone, was a mistake. A chilling, open threat in a room full of jurors, legal experts, and press. Cassie didn't respond. She didn't flinch. But the damage was done. In just 2 minutes, Diddy had gone from composed defendant to a man exposed, his temper, his entitlement, and his total loss of control laid bare for the world to see. Whatever power he thought he held over the room, it vanished with the sound of that glass hitting the floor. Just when it seemed like Diddy's courtroom outburst couldn't be topped, the prosecution calmly turned the spotlight back where it belonged, on the facts. As security stood firm behind Diddy's chair and the judge regained control, the lead prosecutor requested permission to present new evidence. What followed wasn't speculation, and it wasn't hearsay. It was digital proof. She walked to the center of the room, unlocked her tablet, and connected it to the courtroom display system. With a few taps, the screens flickered on, revealing a series of private text messages exchanged between Justin Bieber and Cassie Ventura back in 2017. A heavy silence fell across the courtroom as the words appeared, enlarged for everyone to see. In one message, Cassie wrote, "I don't know what to do anymore. He monitors everything." Bieber's response was immediate and deeply personal. "That's not normal, Cass. What he's doing isn't okay. You need to talk to someone who can help." The messages were short, but the implications were enormous. They didn't just validate Cassie's testimony, they destroyed the defense's entire strategy. These weren't recent texts forged for sympathy. These were years-old digital footprints that showed Cassie was already scared, already isolated, and already reaching out for help long before any lawsuit was filed. That single revelation sent a ripple through the courtroom. Jurors leaned forward, eyes fixed on the screen. One older juror put her hand over her mouth. A younger one scribbled notes at lightning speed. Diddy, meanwhile, went rigid. His face turned from red to pale. His lawyers looked stunned. One of them muttered something and grabbed a legal pad, flipping pages in a panic. Cassie sat silently, her posture unshaken, as if to say, "You wanted proof? Here it is." But it wasn't just the timing of the messages that devastated Diddy's case. It was the names. The prosecutors zoomed in on a conversation referencing Justin Bieber by name. There was no room for misinterpretation. Bieber wasn't just a distant supporter. He had been a witness to Diddy's behavior for years. And this wasn't just Bieber recalling events in hindsight. He had documented concerns at the time they happened. That obliterated any suggestion from the defense that Cassie was fabricating her claims for attention or money. As the text remained on the screen, Diddy's hands began to tremble again. He reached out to grab a document from his lawyer, but it slipped through his fingers. The courtroom watched as the image of power and control he'd carefully built over decades cracked even further. This wasn't just emotional volatility anymore. This was a man being undone by his own history, his own patterns, and the one person he never expected to speak out, Justin Bieber. By the time the jury returned from their brief recess, the courtroom no longer felt like a place of legal order. It felt like the ruins of a fallen empire. The Diddy who had walked in that morning, polished, confident, wearing a crisp designer suit, was gone. In his place sat a man unrecognizable. His shoulders slumped, his tie loosened, his eyes bloodshot and pinned to the floor. He didn't look like someone defending his reputation. He looked like someone who had already lost it. And the jury noticed every detail. Juror number 8, who had smiled politely at Diddy on day 1, now sat stiffly in her seat, not once looking in his direction. Another juror actually shifted their chair slightly farther from the defense table, creating space as if to say, "We see you differently now." Diddy's lawyers gathered tightly around him, their energy frantic and disorganized. One frantically whispered in his ear, another tapped rapidly on a tablet. A third simply stared at the prosecution's screen, his lips pressed into a tight line as if silently conceding what just happened. Their body language told the story. Without a single word, the case was bleeding out, and they had no tourniquet. Meanwhile, the prosecution team exuded quiet control, calm, strategic. The lead prosecutor carefully organized her notes, her expression unreadable. But every now and then, she'd glance at Diddy with something close to satisfaction. Not gloating, but acknowledging the shift in power. And through it all, Cassie remained composed. She didn't gloat, she didn't react to the outburst. She sat upright, hands folded neatly in her lap, her focus pinned directly on the jury. She spoke only when asked and did so with a voice that never cracked. That quiet strength became its own testimony. In contrast to Diddy's chaos, her restraint became proof of everything she had said. She didn't need to argue that she had survived something controlling. Diddy had just demonstrated it himself for everyone to see. Security no longer pretended to be subtle. 2 officers now stood directly behind Diddy's chair, watching him with unwavering focus. One positioned by the courtroom door never removed his hand from his belt. There were no more chances being given. The message was clear. Diddy had crossed a line, and the room was prepared for whatever might happen next. His image, carefully curated over decades, had crumbled not because of a verdict, but because of who he showed himself to be under pressure. And perhaps most damning of all was what came after: silence. The kind of silence that feels final. The jury had seen enough. They didn't need more stories, more spin, or more legal gymnastics. They had seen the reality for themselves of who held power, who abused it, and who finally stood up to it. Diddy hadn't just lost his temper, he'd lost the room. What unfolded in that courtroom wasn't just a legal breakdown, it was a cultural shift. For decades, Diddy had been seen as untouchable. He wasn't just a music mogul, he was a brand, a gatekeeper, a symbol of dominance in an industry built on image and silence. But in just one afternoon, that image collapsed. Publicly, painfully, and irreversibly. And it wasn't a prosecutor or a witness that delivered the final blow. It was Justin Bieber. Bieber's decision to speak out wasn't just brave, it was disruptive. He broke the unspoken code that runs deep in celebrity culture. Protect each other, stay quiet, and keep the machine moving. By choosing to support Cassie, Bieber didn't just validate her story. He cracked open the very structure that allowed Diddy to operate in the shadows for so long. His words carried weight, not just because of his fame, but because they came from someone who had once been inside Diddy's world, someone who had seen things firsthand, and finally chose not to look away. And that's what made Diddy's courtroom breakdown so damning. It wasn't about a man having a bad day under pressure. It was about what happens when someone who's relied on control for decades suddenly realizes he doesn't have it anymore. The threat, the rage, the shattered glass. It wasn't random. It was desperation. Because in that moment, with his legacy on trial and the world watching, Diddy understood something terrifying. The silence was over. The curtain had been pulled back. The stories were no longer whispers behind closed doors. They were out. And now, the jury wasn't just listening, they were watching. Cassie didn't need to convince them with emotion. She didn't need theatrics. Diddy did that part himself. His behavior proved her claims in ways evidence couldn't. And as for Justin Bieber, he lit the match, but the fire was always there, waiting. Now, the question on everyone's mind isn't just what happens to Diddy, it's who's next. Because if Bieber can break the silence, others will follow. This trial is far from over, and with names like Bieber stepping forward, it's clear we're only beginning to see the full picture. So now we want to hear from you. Do you think more celebrities will speak out? And what does Diddy's courtroom meltdown really reveal about the power dynamics in Hollywood? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't hold back. And if you want to stay updated as this story unfolds, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because the silence is breaking, and we'll be here every step of the way.